And now we will move to the other division. Thank you for your testimony. And we're waiting for some written answer to some question we asked. Merci, collègue. I have to apologize to my colleagues because I know I surprised you a little bit. Usually you flag the clerk that you will ask question, but today I suggest it would be easier to manage that we go one by one. I've started with on the left side, and the next time it would be on the right side, and I will try to alternate to be as a and I know that maybe Senator Youssef, I know you have to leave, so at some point just flag me and I could put you in the first. Yeah, exactly. So, okay. So the next division, we will invite Madame Hamel and Madame Fraser. It will be, the next division is Division 9. It's repealing the Consumer-Driven Banking Act, enacting a new one. So we want to welcome you. Maybe we will remove if we can remove the names, okay, and if you time to put your own name. So I will invite you for the record to introduce you and let us know if you have any opening remarks or not. So you have the floor. Welcome.
Bonjour, mon nom est Judith Hamel.
Good morning, my name is Judith Hamel. I'm the Director General of Financial Services at the Department of Finance. With me today, my colleague Kirsten Fraser, Director of the Financial Services Innovation. With your consent, we'd like to give you a brief overview of the measures proposed, including the changes made since Budget 2023.
You just said Kirsten Fraser, Director of Financial Services Innovation. So I'll just give a brief overview. To start, consumer-driven banking, also known as open banking, refer to frameworks that enable consumers and businesses to share their financial data with approved service providers of their choice to access products and services. The legislation includes amendments to complete the consumer-driven banking framework. Broadly speaking, these include establishing a path or paths to entry for entities wishing to participate, so accreditation, and baseline rules for all participants that address risks related to security, national security, consent, and liability. To streamline governance and accreditation by transferring governance to the Bank of Canada, leveraging its existing supervision of retail payment activities. Establish competition as a key objective for the framework by including it as an objective in legislation and establishing new pathways to entry for payment services providers. Appuyer la participation provinciale en
supporting provincial participation by creating a process that would designate certain provisions of the framework as being monitored by a provincial entity, and strengthening the importance of a technical normalization entity in Canada.
Thank you for your opening remarks. When I saw that in the BIA, I remember some conversation, the chat we have here, particularly with Senator Deacon. So I will refrain myself to mention my position on that one. So we will start on my right side by Senator Martin, and suggest 3 minutes each if you agree, colleagues. Senator Martin or Senator Marshall?
Okay, I have just one question. The regulations, probably I should say I have two. The regulations, when can we expect to see them? Because that's usually where the nuts and bolts are, the details.
So I think the objective is to move on the regulations within the next year with a view to completing them as quickly as possible. And so we've been preparing for that. Obviously, it's dependent on the passage of the legislation and the royal assent of the legislation in order for us to move forward.
So when will the legislation come into effect if the regulations aren't going to be done for another year? When do we expect, like, I see this now, we've been talking about open banking for a long time. So is this the end, like, you know, this is it, and we just need the regulations and we're ready to go?
Yeah, and so obviously the first step being the legislation has to pass and receive royal assent, yes. And then we move to the regulations, and in that process we will determine the coming into force of the various provisions of the Act. But again, I think the government's been clear that its objective is to to complete this within 2026 and move to accreditation and the commencement of the framework immediately thereafter.
Just a year. Okay, I think that's
Yes,
kind
I
of
mean, again, this
ambitious,
is
but yeah.
contingent on, the passage of the legislation.
And the regulations.
We can't move forward on the regulations until the legislation receives a royal
That's
assent.
much for me. Thank you.
Senator Walden.
I've got that all drafted for you, so don't worry. I am going to bequeath my 3 minutes to my
Okay.
colleague.
So you got 6 minutes, Senator Deakin.
Well, thank
But
you.
you deserve that. Go.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senator Wallen. Thank you, Ms. Hamill, and wonderful to see you here, Ms. Fraser. It's been a long road. One of the things I'm wondering about is the API. FDX is the main name I keep hearing with U.S. governance, U.S.-based, and when we're looking to have a sovereign Canadian system running our open banking, exchanging of data in our open banking system, that presents a challenge. Is there any, because this is an open source standard, is there any consideration to setting up a Canadian governance structure that then takes that open source standard and starts iterating on it for Canadian purposes and Canadian sovereign control?
The first thing I would say is no decision's been taken with respect to the technical standard at this point. The legislation sets out the process for doing that, which is, by order of the minister. The decision is made by the minister, and then an order is issued. It also sets out the criteria for doing so, and there were a number established in the previous iteration of the legislation, the first introduction of the legislation, which included transparency, openness, good governance, fairness, the ability to safely and efficiently share data. This legislation before us now also introduces two other considerations. These include, the extent to which, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, the entity is one exists in Canada from a legal and fiscal sort of perspective, and the other being that it is meaningfully Canadian and able to meet the objectives of the Act. And so those are reflective, I think, of what you're speaking to right now with respect to ensuring, as you say, that the standard is meaningfully Canadian.
That's very good news, and it doesn't surprise me knowing how much work has gone into this, that thoughtfulness is in place. Looking forward a little bit in terms of right access. So this, we're starting with read access and looking forward to right access, where we really start to get the competitive opportunities emerging more robustly in our system. And we just saw, while Canadians are struggling, the biggest bank profits in history yet again. And that lack of competition is something we need to address. Certainly the Competition Bureau has been very strong on that. The worry I have with is that the right access, the way it's written, seems to be tied to the completion of real-time rail. Mm-hmm. I've likened real-time rail to the sign behind the bar in a British pub which says free beer tomorrow, and I fell for that for quite a while. The worry is that we just are not, we may be seeing the real-time rail process, because it's been so slow, superseded by reality, especially with stablecoin legislation coming in. Mm-hmm. That seems to be a limiting factor.
Yeah, and so I think it's important to clarify that, one, the budget sets out, legislative amendments to bring about the next phase of consumer-driven banking by mid-2027. I believe that's the government's commitment. It also, as you say, sort of aligns the use of the real-time rail with that payment initiation. I think it's important to note that they are aligned in the sense of the speed of payments and the role that kind of speed of payments plays in a right-enabled consumer-driven banking framework. But I would want to be clear that the two are not mutually exclusive, I think is a fair way to characterize.
So I guess just to be really clear, I'm just hoping we don't delay right access because real-time rail still hasn't come forward to fruition and implementation.
Yeah, and I think what I'm trying to say is they are aligned
Yeah.
in respect of this, the kind of speed of payments that's offered through a real-time rail, but they are not mutually exclusive. Indeed, we do see in other jurisdictions that right access or payment initiation is done in a number of different ways.
Okay.
So not just simply on a real-time rail.
Got it. So
Certainly from the speed perspective and the efficiency perspective, there's a logical alignment there.
Okay. Super, thank you. I want to ask now about the accreditation process. We saw in the UK that when they finally launched the accreditation process, that there was a backlog in the system because it just wasn't ready for the scale of responses from new participants. Is there a plan? If we're looking at 2026. One of the realities is we have to be ready to make sure that accreditation it's clear, everybody knows what they have to do, who they need to deal with. I think it's great. We heard from the Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada that they're already thinking about this, but from your standpoint at Finance Canada, what do you feel that the legislation gives the Bank of Canada enough flexibility to be able to have a very seamless registration process that doesn't seem to have the glitches that have occurred elsewhere?
Yeah, and it's a good question. And so, yes, I think it does. The second piece I would say of that is, we don't have the criteria set out because that will come in regulations. Or regulation, rather. We are working closely with the bank right now, obviously in preparation for their new responsibilities, and as is the FCAC with respect to the work they've already been doing in this regard, including with respect to accreditation. So those conversations are happening now to, as you say, be sort of as efficient as possible in that endeavor.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Maybe in second round, I will give you my extra 3 minutes. We'll go to you because we have a lot of champions around the table here, but we have a huge leader as far as open banking is concerned, is Senator Deakin. Senator McBee.
Yeah, thank you. I understand that the guidelines, the regulations aren't set, but I'm wondering how will the new act protect individuals' data privacy, consent, and liability when financial data is being shared with third parties?
That's a great question. So there's sort of a number of ways that's going to happen. The first being actually what we were just speaking about, which is the accreditation. So you want to be able to vet entities to know that they are trusted and able to participate in that kind of a framework, a data sharing framework. The second is that the legislation sets out common rules, and these common rules cover consent, which is sort of your privacy, an element of privacy, liability, security, national security. And so these are common rules that all entities that are participating in the system will be expected to adhere to. And as I said, the legislation sets out a baseline for that. And, they include things, as I say, with respect to express consent, how that is to be managed by the entities, and as well how they are to treat the treatment of data. We've been careful in terms of acknowledging that, there is existing privacy legislation, both at the federal and provincial level, that entities are already required to adhere to. We don't want to overlap or duplicate that. So we've been careful in being very kind of streamlined about what these are. And they're additive to ensure the protection of consumers.
It makes me wonder, between the levels of privacy, would there be some streamlining to create like one rule or like a highest, or would you go to a lowest?
So it's a good question, actually. So what the framework does really is, set sort of a set of common rules that are baseline rules that across the country every entity will be expected to adhere to. Entities are obviously also required to adhere to any applicable legislation at the federal or provincial level. So if a province was to say, for example, the legislation says you must renew consent every 12 months, and a province said, well, we've decided in our legislation that it's going to be every 6 months. Consent must be renewed every 6 months. Then entities operating in that province would be required to adhere to that. But what we have in here, again, is sort of a set of rules that provide consistent protections for consumers across the country, and as well provide a level playing field for all of the entities that are going to be participating across the country.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Youssef.
2 points. One is that this will be a new system we're adopting for the country. Public education will be critical for people to able to access the system, use it with confidence, but equally benefit from it. Because if we're going to bring in some competition, you want people to able to, recognize this could save them some money in some form or another. So what's a built-in mechanism for the public education in this?
So there's two pieces, I think. One is, and this is part of the legislation, that accredited entities will be required to display information indicating that they are accredited. So that's both, an awareness mechanism and also a consumer protection mechanism. So I know when I'm interfacing with, this app that it's part of an accredited system. They are an accredited entity, part of a oversight framework. The second piece is, the FCAC will continue to maintain its role for financial literacy, and that includes ensuring that Canadians understand how to safely share their financial data through a consumer-driven banking framework.
Now, as we know, in the current system, fraud has been highlighted far more so than the bank has been acknowledging publicly. Now we're learning that even more so. So what are the penalties for those who are involved in fraud? Because you're asking Canadians to trust the system. If you lose your information and you lose your somebody fraudulently access your account or what have you, how do we penalize those who are not taking responsibility for the protection of the consumers in the first place? So
there's a couple of measures in the legislation that I'll get to, and the first thing I would want to say is that I think the risk around fraud is significantly greater in a scenario where people are doing screen scraping, which is what is happening right now. And that's the sharing of their banking credentials to access these services. We know what's happening. We know roughly 9 million Canadians are using this, and it presents a risk to them and to the institutions that they are using. So there's a number of provisions in here that are intended to address, let's say, fraudulent use of the system. One is, there are rules or penalties around claiming to be a participant of the framework when one is not. There are rules also, or there will be rules around the use of screen scraping. So the legislation actually places a ban on screen scraping to prevent entities from doing this. Once the framework is in place, that will come into force, and that will come into force after consultation with entities about what the timeline and process for that will be. And so those are some of the measures that are in place. With respect to consumers, I want to be clear that the legislation also spells out that a consumer is not to be held liable for losses in the consumer-driven banking framework, except in instances of gross negligence. And so, there are protections in there for consumers in using this. And I think the final thing I would want to say is that, the piece we're discussing right now is a read-only system, not write access. So it does not give entities the ability to initiate a payment, though the government has obviously signaled a commitment to move in that direction. This framework speaks only to the ability to read or look at the data. And so, not to diminish concerns about fraud at all, but the fraud concerns, this fact that they are less concerning in that context, in the read-only context.
Yeah,
Have you learned anything from other jurisdictions that has enacted open banking?
Yes.
And how can we enact those provisions to ensure we don't repeat the same mistakes?
Yeah, and so I think we have been, some have said, use the term fast follower, and I'll let other people reserve judgment about that, but we've benefited from being able to observe what's happened in other jurisdictions. That includes with respect to fraud. We're following closely, what is happening in the UK, and I think, that there is, evidence in fact that the system is protective, and that the UK has payment initiation enabled, and there is evidence in fact that fraud is lower in that framework than outside of it. So we certainly are looking to them.
Thank you. So in my lifetime, we might be able to access the system.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Joseph. Thank you. Moving to Senatrice Ringuette, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Okay. So we're talking about data risk, and then consumer protection. Like, and I may not be naive, but I'm still surprised that all this system is not under the supervision of OSFI, that, and then that brings on the slate of protection that Canadians, knowingly or not, the deposit protection, okay, the first-time business loan guarantee. So all these items will not be part of this new system. At least that's not what I'm seeing, okay? So what, what are you talking about in regards to consumer protection? I know it's bringing more competition, but what the other side of the equation is what in regards to consumer protection?
A very good question. And so I think the thing we want to be clear about with this framework is that it deals with the sharing of the data, not the underlying products. And that's a very clear distinction because those products are regulated both federally and provincially. So there are existing rules at the provincial and federal level that govern the products which are going to be used or adopted in this system. What the legislation here does is deal squarely with how are you sharing your data with that entity and what it needs to be in place to make sure it's being done securely and that you are protected in the event that something goes wrong.
So who's supervising the rules?
The bank.
Which bank?
The Bank of Canada.
Which they've never been in a supervisory role. Like OSFI has always been in supervising the banking system in Canada.
And so, I think it's fair to say that the bank does actually have a supervisory role with respect to retail payments, and there is quite...
Since 2 years.
Yes, and so there is quite a bit of alignment here in terms of the activity and the entities that are going to be overseen. I think that and that the legislation itself provides strong protection for consumers in respect of the data sharing piece, which is additive in effect to the protections that are in place with respect to the products and services and the rules they are governed under at the federal and provincial level.
Still have concern, but anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Lafreda.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you for being here. You've mentioned national security a few times, and the Act does include enhanced national security safeguards. What types of risks has the government identified in national security, and how will these risks be mitigated in practice?
Okay, and so, I think I would speak sort of first about the risks. And obviously when you have data, people's sensitive financial data moving, there are risks that are implicit with that, which can extend to national security. The legislation sets out a number of provisions, which I do have colleagues here in case there are more specific questions that deal with the national security aspects of our work. The first of these is that every entity that's going to be participating is going to be subject to a national security screen to determine whether or not they are appropriate and eligible to participate in the framework. And there are other mechanisms in there as well for the minister to to order entities to do certain things in respect of national security. The minister has the authority to suspend or revoke with respect to concerns around national security. And so that's sort of the general flavor of what is within the legislation as it concerns to national security.
And I have a few. What's the economic impact of open banking? What will be the economic impact, and who's accountable for, having it meet time, budget, and everything?
Who is accountable for it? So, obviously there's a certain component that we are responsible for as the Department of Finance, and the Bank of Canada as the regulator will also be responsible for. So there's a bit of shared responsibility there. In terms of the economic impact, it's an interesting question because open banking systems are relatively nascent in other jurisdictions. So attempts to kind of quantify the impact there aren't many of them, let's just say. And so, we know there are estimates in the UK. I believe those are around like $20 to $30 billion annually. But they're nascent.
Positive for us to
yes,
follow.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
you're certain about that
Yes.
positive impact?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you,
Merci.
Senator. Senator Sinclair.
Bonjour, mesdames.
Good afternoon. Canada is known as being, the target of online fraud. According to the Anti-Fraud Centre of Canada, losses reached $638 million in 2024, with over 108,000 incidents, and only 5 to 10% of victims actually report. In Canada, banks have no legal obligation to reimburse cases of fraud from a credit or debit cards, or rather debit cards, contrary to credit cards. So why does the bill still not create a clear obligation to reimburse victims of fraud when this situation has become a true epidemic?
Ouais, je peux commenter. On va, il y a
I can answer that. So there's another division that deals specifically with anti-fraud.
I will answer the question when we'll be to that division. Otherwise, it would be hard to manage. So, Senator Sinclair, maybe, because right now we study the division number 9, which is more about open banking. So your question is very relevant, but I propose to postpone. Have you any other question related more to the division 9?
On parle des banques, la gestion.
Yes, so you've talked about the management of banks and policies requiring banks to have policies and procedures. Okay, well, I'll wait for the next division.
Thank you for joining us today. My first question is a very narrow and technical one. The definition of participating entity is very specific, and a lot of these entities are massive conglomerates. So, for example, a bank will own wealth management, they'll own an investment dealer, they'll own an insurance company, and there'll be, I expect, leakage of information. I know there's discretionary ability in here, but some of those subsidiary entities and affiliates aren't identified as being part of the system proper here. Can you tell me what your intention is on who gets access to data and coverage?
Good question. So, yes, the legislation refers to participating entities broadly, and so the idea being that an entity comes into the system to provide a service to the consumer, and they, because of the requirements around reciprocity, that is, data must flow both ways at the consumer's request. We don't identify them as you're a data holder, you're a bank, you're a fintech. We identify them as participating entities who may, at some points, be, providing the information, and it may at other points be receiving the information. With respect to your question about subsidiaries, it would be a question around accreditation and how that entity elected to move forward with its accreditation application, and so whether or not it included those subsidiaries. There are rules inside of the legislation around the treatment of the data, which say effectively you may only use the data for the stated purpose that you have identified and to which the consumer has consented. So you cannot give the data to your subsidiary or another party unless the consumer has said, yes, I consent to you doing that.
They would have to be accredited too, otherwise they're not caught by the web
Correct.
of all the regulations
Correct.
as well.
Correct. So, it would depend, and it's like there's probably case-specific situations. Well, there will be case-specific situations as to whether an entity decides to include its subsidiaries or just include one of its lines of business. So as opposed to kind of getting into the nuances of that, I think that's probably the best way to explain it.
Brief question on sovereignty of data to follow up on Senator Deacon's. Canadians are concerned about sovereignty of data, and you've suggested this is going to get deferred to the regulations. I don't see anything in the Act that addresses that, which means we won't have any oversight on that if it happens. I see it as a whole here, being absent from the statute proper. Am I correct on that observation?
So I think there's sort of two pieces here. One is talking about the technical standard, which is the technical standards body, which will be the body that sets the instructions for how technically the data is shared. So that's the piece we were speaking about there, about that body. With respect to, data sovereignty, again, I would point to sort of the rules around how an entity can use the data that a consumer provides them or permits them to have access to. And then I think the final piece I would say on that is that sort of the data sovereignty piece is bigger than, just this framework itself.
Last question, costs. Amongst the various, there's a lot of costs for the Bank of Canada to gear up and do even their small piece. There's costs for participating entities. It seems like nobody can charge costs for what's going on here in terms of the operationalizing the system. But the bank, for example, under Section 4, sub C and D, need to promote the activities here. Can you give us some indication of the costing to the Bank of Canada to operationalize this and confirm that other people can't charge for participation in the sharing of data?
And so I can start with a question around the Bank of Canada. And so, want to point out the Bank of Canada has existing staff and processes that we can be leveraged to operationalize this framework. And that's part of the rationale behind the transfer to the Bank of Canada. Additional costs related to this will be funded through a reduction of up to $19.3 million over 2 years in its remittances to the government's consolidated revenue fund. So that's the funding mechanism, if you will. On the second piece, yes, the legislation sets out that data that is being shared inside of the framework by participating entities inside of the framework must be shared without cost. And so, yes, I can confirm that.
Thank you, Senator Dalphond, and maybe back to the sponsor after that of the bill. So, Senator Dalphond.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. So how will this work in terms of application through provincial bodies? Like Desjardins, for example, is part of the network. Can that be delegated to a provincial entity, like the power of the bank? And if there are any breaches, will the provincial entity send out penalties? How exactly would it work in practice? In terms of penalties and in terms of the consumer protection system, the Quebec system, I assume would apply as well. Well, I can start by talking about the designated regulation, if that's okay. This is how it works. A province presents a request to the department regarding certain provisions, and having the provincial body be the monitor, and then there would be a memorandum of understanding with the Bank of Canada that would be in place, and a departmental directive would be made, and then the provincial or territorial entity would have the responsibility of enforcing the provisions. And those provisions that can be designated would be ones where provinces already have jurisdiction, so like protection of privacy and the protection of consumer authentication, so as well as consumer complaints. And the provisions relative to accreditation and membership would remain federal jurisdiction. So that's a little bit how it would work. And the goal would be that provincial regulatory bodies would work together with the Bank of Canada to do the enforcement. So that's how that would work. And finally, I would just say that we've worked together with provincial representatives to establish a framework that recognize that there are laws that exist now relative to consumer protection. And we want to make sure that there's no duplication of provincial regulations. I thought that there was a lot of regulatory power given to the bank and also to the minister, so I imagined that both of them could emit regulations. But if a province is then given the administration of the system, the province would have to apply the regulations made by the Bank of Canada. Is that correct? Or would they enforce regulation, put forward by the regulatory body in Quebec? So provincial regulators monitor the framework and would monitor a single framework with a single set of regulations. The goal would be not to have a patchwork. So they would all apply under a single system. Yes. But as Kristen said previously, provincial bodies could add their own standards if they wish to. So standards about data sharing, privacy rights, and so on. And the entities concerned, like credit unions, for example, already have established relationships with provincial regulators. So that would facilitate things and reduce the administrative burden. Thank you, Senator Dalphond. I might have some comments at the end. Senator Pupatello.
I have just a quick comment, not even a question. I want to congratulate you on the caliber of the people that you bring forward to the committee. And I have to add that Kirsten and I worked together at Queen's Park many years ago. So I'm delighted to see you doing so well and answering the questions so directly and fulsomely. I like to think that was great training by all of your friends at Queen's Park. So it's great to see you, Kirsten. And of course, everybody that's gathered tonight. I always think that we have terrific people answering questions. I do want to make a comment about this in particular, that you selected to use the Bank of Canada with its efficiency as the rationale and all of the expertise that is in there. A number of questions have come up through Banking and Finance Committee related to the bill, and that same concept was a question repeatedly around the Canada Build and creating a new organization when there were other organizations that perhaps could do exactly what you've done with the Bank of Canada in this regard. So that's only a comment. You can comment on that if you wish, but great to see you, Kirsten.
Not much to add in respect of the Bank of Canada. I think, the objective there was, efficiency of the framework given the existing oversight of entities that will be likely participants of the consumer-driven banking framework, the efficiency of getting the framework up and running. That was really sort of the thinking and the rationale behind the transfer to the Bank of Canada.
Thank you. As a chair, usually I refrain myself to give my strong opinion, but in that particular case, I remind a strong discussion we have when it was about 18 months ago when we talk about the Monday go to FCC. So nothing wrong with FCC by itself and the official, but I think that my comfort zone has increased big time when I see Bank of Canada. I know Desjardins is into the loop because they are involved much more with Bank of Canada than FCC. So, and maybe if the committee feel the necessity, we could invite even Desjardins because they have a sensitivity aspect in Quebec regarding the regulators. But I think that with Bank of Canada, and I want to echo comments from my Senator Deacon, when we saw that, we have the same reaction that, oops, finally, I think that it would be, it's more logical, and the expertise is there, and financial institutions deal with it. So, colleagues, here, if you agree, since our two witnesses, Madame Fraser and Madame Hamel, have to be involved in the division number 15, 16, 45, I try to be as much as efficient as we could. Maybe we'll have a risk that we'll not be able to have all witnesses. But do you agree that I will invite our two witnesses to stay, and we will move directly to division 15 and 16? I propose that 15, 16 to be together because this two division is related to amend the Bank Act about the regarding the amount of fund deposit by a check to be withdrawn, and 16 is about the prevention customer fraud that Senator Enkel has talked about. So if you agree, and if we are very efficient, and after that go 55, and maybe our two witnesses will be free for the rest of the evening, and no necessity to be back, because I have concern otherwise that, so but if you agree, okay, Senator Deakin.
Chair, if I could just ask one more question about
open banking, go ahead
banking.
to conclude that division. Yeah, go ahead.
If that's acceptable to colleagues, thank you very much. I just, again, I'd like to echo Senator Pupatello's comments. You've done a tremendous job, and it's really great to see you in this position. We've waited a long time for this. I want to ask just very specifically about the transition from screen scraping. There has not been any known data breaches using screen scraping that that we're aware of, but if we have a harsh transition, there's a risk that delays could really disrupt business quite substantially for a number of financial technology companies. And what we need, we know there's been a lot of resistance from our principal banks in Canada as to the implementation of this. I could see this being a challenge. The other element I just want to ask you to speak to is the completeness of the data that consumers would like to see transferred to a new entity and control over that. So those are the two things, just final, because I think they're quite central to the effectiveness of the building of the new system.
And so just on the first with respect to screen scraping, I want to be clear that no other jurisdiction has done this yet. And so, there is a very clear, however, provision in legislation that sets out that, there will be a ban on screen scraping. The government's also been clear that that will happen in consultation with entities. And so there needs to be a discussion of how that transition happens, what that time looks like. And further, again, because we don't really have other jurisdictions to look to, as an example in this regard, are there circumstances in which you would continue to permit screen scraping, right? So there's a bit of a dialogue, a discussion, a consultation that has to happen there in respect of that, and that is the plan. The framework needs to be in place, for us to get to that. The second question on the completeness of the data, the data list, the scope is listed as, checking, savings, lending, but it's fairly broad in that respect and covering a number of financial products. And it is, data provided by the consumer and data about those products. That's the way it's defined in the legislation, with derived data being outside of that scope. So that is the broad kind of scope of the legislation. There will need to be discussion with I think with the Bank of Canada and in the course of the legislation, the drafting of regulations to sort out what precisely that looks like. And that will come, I think, probably maybe a bit from guidance and maybe a bit from regulation.
So I interpret from what you said that saying derived data is outside, I think, is a pretty clear line. Yes. And so it's everything up until derived data. So that's good to hear. Thank you.
So I want to correct that. Madame Hamel was still with us, and Madame Fraser, thank you for your testimony.